Well, top diplomats from Southeast Asia are meeting in the capital of Laos to discuss conflicting territorial claims in the South China Sea and escalating fighting in Myanmar. Rivalry between the United States and China has rattled nerves in the region. Top officials from the two superpowers met on the sidelines to discuss ways to defuse growing tensions.
While the 10 member states of ASEAN met to discuss the strategic direction of Southeast Asia, much attention was focused on two guests of honor, the United States and China. Until recently, tensions between China and the Philippines were flaring over a Filipino outpost on the second Thomas Shoal. Both countries say it's in a part of the South China Sea that belongs to them. Last month, Chinese vessels rammed Filipino supply boats on their way to the area. But then, a week ago, Beijing and Manila agreed to a deal, cooling off tensions, at least for the time being. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken praised both sides for their diplomacy.
We are pleased to take note of the successful resupply today, the second Thomas Shoal, which is the product of an agreement reached between the Philippines and China. We applaud that and hope and expect to see that it continues going forward.
While the U.S.'s top diplomat also criticized Beijing for adding to regional tensions in the first place, he met with his Chinese counterpart for the sixth time in recent weeks. But for Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who was also present, there was no sit-down with Blinken. The two have barely been in the same room since Russia invaded Ukraine more than 2 years ago. Lavrov said he was concerned about a recently announced nuclear agreement between the U.S. and South Korea, which the two allies say is aimed at responding to nuclear threats from North Korea. The United States recently entered into a joint nuclear planning agreement with the Republic of Korea. So far, we cannot even get an explanation of what this means. But we have no doubt that this causes additional concern. Moreover, they are trying to bring Japan into this scheme of joint nuclear planning. Three major powers on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit, competing for influence in Southeast Asia and beyond.
I look forward to a productive and constructive. Michael Vatikiotis is a senior advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and I asked him how that's been reflected at this summit.
I think the timing of the summit coincided with a deal that was basically an agreement that was made between China and the Philippines just in the last week or so that has kind of significantly reduced the level of tension in and around Second Thomas Shoal, which had become a significant flashpoint, not just between the Philippines and China, but potentially between the US and China. The agreement, the details of which we're not really quite sure of, was made at a diplomatic level and appears to have worked in the sense that there was a supply mission to the feature, the submerged feature on which the Philippines has beached a landing ship, which wasn't interrupted by the Chinese, which wasn't the case a few weeks ago. So all this was well timed for the summit in the sense that China and the Philippines appear to have managed to reduce the tensions between them.
Well, also notably, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was at the summit as well, and we know that he did not speak directly to his U.S. counterpart. They were at least in the same room. Is this symbolic in any way?
Well, what I think is interesting is that some ASEAN members are using Lavrov's presence or used Lavrov's presence together with Tony Blinken to remind the United States in particular that in addition to the Ukraine war and the pressure for support for Ukraine from the United States in particular, it's important that the United States takes into account other issues where there are a violation of human rights and of course atrocities, namely the situation in Gaza. This was a point made very strongly by the Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi, pointing out that while the United States has concerns about Ukraine, has concerns about China, it's also important to have concerns about Israel and Palestine. And so I think in that context, Lavrov's presence, even though the two ministers didn't speak, very much reminded this region, Southeast Asia, that one has to strike a balance between the concerns of the West and the concerns of the global South.
That was Michael Vatikiotis with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue joining us from Bangkok. Many thanks indeed for your insights.
I'd like to bring in Richard Haydarian for more, an author, columnist, and political scientist closely following events in Southeast Asia. Welcome. First of all, did these talks between Wang Yi and Blinken really dominate the agenda at this meeting?
Well, I mean, the clash of titans, or at least the meeting between the two titans, is always a top agenda or a top area of concern for everyone in the region, including in Southeast Asia. Obviously, you had also other major powers, including Russia, also represented in this meeting. But as far as U.S. and China are concerned, this was about establishing guardrails. Of course, the U.S. is heading into an elections. I don't think President Biden is in the mood to pick a fight elsewhere outside the United States as the election approaches. So they want to establish guardrails, but there are multiple points of tensions, structural tensions between the two sides. And in fairness to Blinken and also to China, I think they took a stratified and calibrated approach. So on Russia, Blinken was absolutely clear that there will be countermeasures, meaning potentially sanctions against Chinese companies who have been significantly enabling Russia's war against Ukraine. But on South China Sea, for instance, another area of concern because U.S. ally, the Philippines, has been having tussles with China, he sounded a little bit more optimistic because both Philippines and China have been trying to find a diplomatic solution to ensure that their own disputes will not escalate into something more worrying. And then on issues like, for instance, Myanmar, Blinken and China actually are trying to work together in order to encourage and support ASEAN to find a more stable situation there after more than 2 years of civil war. So multiple points of tension, but a very kind of a stratified, calibrated approach.
Yeah, much going on here. I want to ask you a little bit more about these tensions between China and the Philippines. Of course, these have been escalating for months. Do you get the impression that there were any breakthroughs in this meeting? Did they find any common cause to try and soothe these tensions?
Well, obviously, things are very much calibrated and coordinated in a sense that I think both Philippines and U.S. have been in a lot of conversation. I mean, they're allied. There's a mutual defense treaty. So if something goes wrong, the U.S. will inevitably be involved militarily or otherwise. So I think the Philippines ahead of this summit tried to really dial down tensions. And there was some sort of a temporary agreement between China and the Philippines whereby the Philippines resupplies its troops in disputed areas, but does not publicize it anymore based on its so-called transparency initiative. So there have been some dialing down in the escalation, interim measures. We don't know if that's going to last, but clearly that was coordinated also between Philippines and the rest of the region. But also the Philippines doesn't want to be isolated because the Philippines is the only country in ASEAN nowadays that is openly calling out China and standing up to China. But Philippines wants to work with other countries like Malaysia and Vietnam and even Indonesia, who also have their own maritime concerns. So ahead of this summit, the Philippines was already dialing it down. Whether this could last for the foreseeable future, I'm not very sure about it. But at least for now, it looks like every side is trying to find some sort of a common ground.
Yeah, with that said, looking ahead, do you think there is a real risk of war between the Philippines and China?
Oh, absolutely. We were very close to that. I mean, just a few weeks ago, a Filipino serviceman lost his finger. And the big debate in the Philippines was whether that should be the ground for invoking mutual defense treaty with the United States. Because on one hand, you can say that, the mutual defense treaty can only apply if an armed attack happened. But it's also not only about what China uses, it's also about the consequences of China's aggressive activities. So even if China hasn't used armed attack, it has used very aggressive intimidation tactics and other kinds of forms of intimidation against the Philippines. So not long ago, there were conversations about whether this is going to escalate into something. But I think eventually cool heads prevailed, and we're back again to essentially zero because diplomacy doesn't mean that we are resolving this. Diplomacy just means we are freezing this situation until we can find a more opportune moment to discuss it. And the U.S. heading into elections, I think everyone understands that no one wants a conflict in the foreseeable future.
So in that sense, back to square one. Thank you so much for joining us with that analysis. That is Richard Haydarian. We very much appreciate your time.
Pleasure.